It wasn't the kind of discovery you expect to make in your own backyard. I'm talking about the cord. Bright orange, thick as a garden hose, and dangling over my fence like it owned the place. At first, I thought I was hallucinating, maybe too much caffeine, maybe not enough, but no. It was real. And when I followed it to its source, my jaw hit the ground. There it was, plugged into my outlet, snaking its way into Karen's yard like some sort of parasitic vine feeding off my electricity. Karen. Of course, it was Karen. Who else would have the audacity to steal power from her neighbor and act like it was perfectly normal? This wasn't just an extension cord, it was a declaration of war. Now, let me tell you about Karen. If you've ever lived in suburbia, you already know her type. She's the self-appointed queen of the HOA, armed with a clipboard, a bad attitude, and a knack for turning minor inconveniences into federal offenses. Karen lives right next door to me, and from the moment I moved in, she's been on a mission to make my life miserable. My grass is too long? Complaint filed. Trash cans out 5 minutes early? Another complaint. I once parked my car slightly crooked in my driveway. Guess what? Complaint. But this cord? This was new territory. I stared at it for a good minute, trying to process what I was looking at. It wasn't just draped over my fence. It was plugged into one of my outdoor outlets, my outlet, and ran straight into Karen's backyard, where it powered what appeared to be an industrial-grade margarita machine and some truly hideous party lights. I took a deep breath and marched over to her front door. Karen answered almost immediately, clipboard in hand, as if she'd been waiting for me like some sort of suburban overlord ready to issue decrees. "Oh, hi, Jack," she said with that fake smile that never quite reached her eyes. "What can I do for you?" "Well," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the rage bubbling under the surface. "I noticed there's an extension cord running from your yard into mine. It's plugged into my outlet." "Oh, that," she said breezily, waving her hand like we were discussing something trivial, like the weather or a neighborhood bake sale. "I needed some extra power for my backyard party this weekend. Your outlet wasn't being used, so I figured it wouldn't be a problem." "Karen," I said slowly, emphasizing every syllable like I was explaining basic math to a toddler, "you can't just plug things into other people's outlets without asking." She tilted her head at me like she was genuinely confused by this concept. "Why not? It's not like you're using it." I blinked at her in disbelief. "Because it's my property," I said firmly. "Well," she replied with a shrug that made me want to scream into the void. "Technically, that part of your yard falls under the HOA's visual easement rules. Now, if you're not familiar with HOA visual easements, and why would you be unless you've been cursed to live under one of these suburban dictatorships? They're supposed to ensure that landscaping and fences don't obstruct sightlines or ruin the aesthetic of the neighborhood. But Karen had apparently decided that this rule also gave her permission to siphon electricity from her neighbors like some sort of power-hungry vampire. "That's not how visual easements work," I said through gritted teeth. "Oh, really?" She shot back with a smirk that could curdle milk. "Because I'm pretty sure I know more about HOA regulations than you do." At this point, reasoning with Karen felt about as productive as trying to teach algebra to a raccoon. It wasn't going to end well for me. So I did what any rational person would do. I went home and Googled HOA visual easement laws. Sure enough, there was nothing about easements giving neighbors permission to mooch off your electricity. Armed with this knowledge and feeling slightly smug, I returned to Karen's doorstep later that afternoon with printed copies of the HOA bylaws in hand, like they were sacred texts handed down from Mount Suburbia itself. "Look," I said firmly as she opened the door again, already looking annoyed at my presence. "There's nothing in these rules that says you can use my outlet." Karen crossed her arms and gave me a look that could have melted steel beams. "Well," she said icily, "if you're going to be difficult about this, maybe I'll just have to file a complaint about your fence height." "My fence height?" I repeated incredulously. "Yes," she said smugly. "It looks taller than what's allowed under HOA guidelines." "It's exactly 6 feet tall," I replied through gritted teeth. She said with mock concern as she glanced toward my backyard like she was measuring it telepathically. "Are you sure? Because it looks taller." At this point, 2 things became abundantly clear. 1, Karen wasn't going to unplug that cord willingly. And 2, this was war. The next morning, I woke up to find an official-looking letter from the HOA taped to my front door like some sort of suburban scarlet letter. Sure enough, Karen had filed multiple complaints against me. One about my fence height, which was perfectly legal. Another about my trash cans being out 5 minutes early, a crime so heinous it should be punishable by exile. And yet another claiming my lawn wasn't green enough. A bold accusation considering we were in the middle of a drought. I spent hours compiling evidence. Receipts proving my fence height was within legal limits. Screenshots of weather reports showing mandatory water restrictions. Photos of Karen's own lawn looking like something out of Mad Max. When I presented all this at the next HOA meeting, Karen sat there with her arms crossed like she was starring in her own courtroom drama. Even after the HOA sided with me on every single issue, and trust me, watching her face during their rulings was worth every second. She refused to back down about the extension cord. "It's just electricity," she snapped during one particularly heated exchange at the meeting table. "Why are you making such a big deal about it?" "Because it's my electricity," I shot back. "Well," she huffed dramatically as if auditioning for daytime TV stardom, "if you're going to be so petty about it, maybe I'll just have to take legal action." Legal action? Over an extension cord? At this point, all I could do was laugh. Because if there's one thing Karen loves more than margaritas and party lights, it's threatening lawsuits she has no intention of following through on. That night, as I sat in my backyard staring at the offending cord still draped over my fence like some sort of neon orange middle finger pointed directly at me, I made a decision. If Karen wanted electricity so badly, well, let's just say she'd get exactly what she deserved, but on my terms. The morning after the HOA meeting, I woke up to find Karen had escalated. Again. This time, she'd gone full Karen. There was a neon green sticky note plastered on my front door that read, "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Her lawyer. Over an extension cord. I couldn't help but laugh. What kind of lawyer takes on a case about a backyard outlet? I pictured some guy in a cheap suit sitting in his office, surrounded by stacks of paperwork labeled Karen versus the world, wondering how his life had come to this. But Karen wasn't done. Oh no. That afternoon, I came home to find her standing in my yard with a tape measure in hand. She was measuring my fence. Again, I watched her from my car for a moment, trying to decide whether to laugh or cry. Eventually, I got out and walked over. "Karen," I said, startling her so badly she dropped the tape measure. "What are you doing?" "Just verifying," she said, brushing imaginary dirt off her clipboard like she was some kind of forensic investigator. "I'm pretty sure your fence is at least an inch too tall." "It's not," I said flatly. "Well," she sniffed, "we'll see about that." And then she did something that truly blew my mind. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of my fence from every possible angle, muttering under her breath about evidence and violations. At one point, she even crouched down in the grass like she was trying to get an artsy shot for Instagram. That's when it hit me. Karen wasn't just annoying. She was dedicated. This woman had made it her life's mission to prove that I was some kind of suburban outlaw, and she wasn't going to stop until I was either evicted or institutionalized. The next day, I got another letter from the HOA. This one accused me of violating the neighborhood's landscaping guidelines because, and I quote, "The color of your lawn is inconsistent with community standards." My lawn. My poor, drought-stricken lawn that was doing its best to survive on the 2 gallons of water per week we were allowed under city regulations. Meanwhile, Karen's lawn looked like the set of a low-budget horror movie. Patchy, brown, and littered with plastic flamingos that had seen better days. I called the HOA office to complain, but the woman who answered sounded like she'd been dealing with Karen for years and had long since given up on life. "Look," she said in a monotone voice that suggested she was one bad phone call away from quitting. "If you can prove your lawn isn't violating any rules, we'll dismiss the complaint." "Prove it?" I asked incredulously. "How am I supposed to prove that my lawn is fine?" "I don't know," she said with a sigh. "Take pictures or something." So that's what I did. I spent an entire Saturday photographing my lawn from every possible angle while my neighbors watched from their windows like it was some kind of live performance art piece. Then I printed out the photos and attached them to a strongly worded letter explaining that my lawn was perfectly legal and that Karen should focus on watering her own grass instead of filing baseless complaints about mine. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. The following week, I came home to find a group of landscapers in my backyard. My backyard, digging up the dirt near the fence line. "What's going on here?" I demanded. One of the landscapers looked up and shrugged. "Lady next door hired us to install some new plants." "In my yard?" I asked, my voice climbing several octaves. "She said it was part of the HOA easement," he replied with a shrug before going back to digging. I stormed over to Karen's house and banged on her door like a man possessed. She opened it with that same infuriatingly fake smile and said, "Oh, hi, Jack. What can I do for you? You can explain why there are landscapers in my yard." I snapped. "Oh," she said innocently, as if this was all just a big misunderstanding. "I thought you'd appreciate some new plants." "In my yard," I repeated. "Well," she said with a shrug, "it's technically part of the visual easement." "That's not how easements work," I shouted. "Well," she said again, because apparently that's her favorite word. "If you have an issue with it, maybe you should take it up with the HOA." At this point, I realized Karen wasn't just annoying. She was delusional. She genuinely believed that everything within a 10-foot radius of her property belonged to her by divine right. The next day, I called the city zoning office to confirm once and for all where my property line ended and hers began. The woman who answered sounded far more competent than anyone at the HOA and promised to send me an official map within 24 hours. When the map arrived via email, it confirmed what I already knew. Karen had been encroaching on my property for years, not just with her extension cord but also with her plants, her tacky garden gnomes, and even part of her patio furniture. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to fight back. First, I printed out copies of the map along with every HOA bylaw related to property boundaries and easements. Then I highlighted all the sections Karen had violated in bright yellow, so there would be no room for debate. Next, I called up the landscaping company Karen had hired and informed them that they were trespassing on private property without permission. The guy on the other end sounded genuinely horrified and promised to send someone over immediately to fix their mistake. Finally, and this was the piece de resistance, I went out into my backyard and unplugged Karen's extension cord from my outlet before tossing it back over the fence like a snake shedding its skin. When Karen came storming over later that afternoon demanding an explanation, I calmly handed her a copy of the map along with a list of all her violations and said, "If you don't stop trespassing on my property immediately, you'll be hearing from my lawyer." Her face turned bright red as she scanned through the documents like they were written in ancient Greek. For once in her life, Karen didn't have anything snarky to say. She just turned around and stomped back into her house without another word. That night, as I sat in my backyard enjoying a well-deserved beer under the glow of my outdoor lights powered by my electricity, and not hers, I couldn't help but feel a small sense of victory. Sure, Karen would probably find some new way to make my life miserable tomorrow, but for now, peace had been restored. Sort of. After the whole landscaper debacle and my glorious unplugging of Karen's extension cord, I thought naively, I'll admit, that we'd reached some sort of ceasefire. But no, Karen wasn't the type to let things go. She was like a suburban Terminator, programmed to destroy anything that dared stand in her way. And apparently I was her Sarah Connor. Started small. A few days after our last confrontation, I noticed little things. My trash cans mysteriously tipped over, HOA notices appearing in my mailbox for infractions I hadn't committed, like unauthorized garden gnomes. I don't even own garden gnomes, and passive-aggressive sticky notes left on my fence that said things like, "Your grass is looking a little patchy. Just saying." But then she escalated. One morning, I walked outside to find a brand new security camera mounted on her side of the fence, pointed directly into my backyard. It was so blatant it almost felt like a joke. I mean, who does that? Who wakes up one day and thinks, "You know what my neighbor needs? Less privacy." I marched over to her house, knocked on the door, and waited. When she finally opened it, she looked at me like I was a Jehovah's Witness interrupting her afternoon wine. "Karen," I said, gesturing toward the camera. "What is that?" "It's a security camera," she said matter-of-factly. "I can see that," I replied. "Why is it pointed at my yard?" "Well," she said with her trademark smugness, "I've had some concerns about your activities lately." "My activities?" I repeated, incredulous. "Yes," she said, crossing her arms like she was about to lecture me on proper suburban behavior. "There's been a lot of noise coming from your backyard at odd hours." "Karen," I said slowly, trying to keep my voice steady, "the only noise coming from my backyard is me mowing the lawn or grilling burgers." "Well," she sniffed, "you can never be too careful." At this point, I realized there was no reasoning with her. She'd crossed into full-blown lunacy. So I did what any sane person would do. I called the HOA. Now, calling the HOA felt a bit like asking a sloth to run a marathon. It wasn't exactly efficient. But after explaining the situation and sending them photos of the camera, and maybe exaggerating just a little by saying it made me feel unsafe, they agreed to investigate. A week later, Karen received an official notice from the HOA demanding she remove the camera immediately or face fines. And let me tell you, watching her climb up a ladder in her yard to take it down while muttering angrily under her breath was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But Karen wasn't done yet. Oh no. If anything, the HOA's intervention seemed to fuel her vendetta against me. She started hosting loud parties in her backyard every weekend, complete with blaring music, obnoxious laughter, and what sounded suspiciously like karaoke renditions of Bon Jovi songs. And guess where she plugged in all her equipment? That's right, her trusty orange extension cord running straight into my outlet. At this point, I knew something had to be done. Karen wasn't just an annoying neighbor. She was an energy thief. A suburban pirate plundering my electricity for her margarita machines and karaoke machines and who knows what else machines. So I hatched a plan. Now, before you judge me too harshly, let me just say this. Everything I did was 100% legal. Petty? Sure. Over the top? Maybe. But illegal? Absolutely not. First, I went online and ordered a device called a circuit breaker tripper. For those of you who aren't familiar with this little gem of technology, it's basically a gadget that detects unusual electrical activity and shuts off power to prevent overloads or fires, or in this case, Karen's backyard raggers. Next, I installed it on the outlet Karen had been using without permission. It took about 15 minutes and required nothing more than a screwdriver and some basic wiring knowledge. Thank you, YouTube tutorials. Once it was in place, all I had to do was wait. The following Saturday night, Karen threw another one of her infamous parties. The music started around 7 p.m., something upbeat and obnoxious, and by 8 p.m., the karaoke machine had made its grand entrance. By 9 p.m., they were belting out "Livin' on a Prayer," so loudly that I could hear it from inside my house with all the windows closed. And then it happened. At exactly 9:15 p.m., right in the middle of what sounded like an especially off-key chorus, the circuit breaker tripper did its job. There was a loud pop, followed by complete silence as all the lights in Karen's backyard went out at once. I peeked out my window just in time to see Karen standing there in stunned disbelief as her guests looked around awkwardly in the dark. Someone shouted something about checking the fuse box. Someone else suggested calling an electrician. And Karen? Karen just stood there clutching her margarita glass like it was a lifeline. Eventually, they managed to get some flashlights going and continued their party without electricity. But let's be honest. Karaoke just isn't the same without neon lights and booming speakers. The next morning, Karen showed up at my door looking furious. "Did you mess with my power?" she demanded. "Nope," I said innocently. "Must have been an electrical issue on your end." "Well," she huffed dramatically, because everything Karen does is dramatic. "I'm going to have an electrician look into it." "Good idea," I said with a smile that probably didn't help defuse the situation. Over the next week or so, Karen had multiple electricians come out to inspect her setup, all of whom told her there was nothing wrong with her wiring but suggested she check with her neighbors about possible interference. Of course, she never confronted me directly again. Probably because deep down she knew exactly what had happened but couldn't prove it. And just like that, peace returned to my backyard. Or at least as much peace as one can expect when living next door to someone like Karen. Karen, as it turned out, wasn't just bad at letting things go. She was actively allergic to it. After the great circuit breaker incident, I thought she might back off for a while, maybe even take a weekend to reflect on her life choices. But no, Karen came back swinging, and this time she brought the HOA into it. One fine Monday morning, I woke up to find a letter from the HOA taped to my door. Not mailed, taped, like some kind of suburban ransom note. Inside was a formal notice stating that I was under investigation for creating an unsafe environment in the neighborhood. Unsafe? Me? The guy who spends his weekends grilling burgers and minding his own business? I couldn't help but laugh. But as I read further, I realized Karen had really gone for it this time. She'd accused me of everything from tampering with electrical equipment, her beloved extension cord, to violating noise ordinances. Because apparently mowing your lawn counts as a felony now. The best part? She claimed that my actions had caused her emotional distress. Emotional distress over a circuit breaker. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry, or maybe both at the same time. Now, if you've never been the subject of an HOA investigation, let me paint you a picture. It's like being on trial in a kangaroo court where the judge, jury, and executioner are all wearing pastel polos and sipping iced tea. They don't care about facts or logic. They care about community harmony, which is HOA code for keeping Karen happy. I called the HOA office to get more details, and the woman who answered sounded like she'd rather be anywhere else. Yes, she said in a bored tone when I asked about the complaint. We've received multiple reports about disturbances coming from your property. Multiple reports? I repeated. From who? I can't disclose that information, she replied. Let me guess, I said dryly. It rhymes with barren. She didn't respond, but the awkward silence told me everything I needed to know. The investigation officially began later that week when two members of the HOA board showed up at my house unannounced. They introduced themselves as Linda and Bob, classic HOA names, and proceeded to walk around my property taking notes on clipboards like they were appraising a crime scene. Nice fence, Bob said at one point, scribbling something down. Thanks, I replied cautiously. Is it 6 feet tall? Linda asked, narrowing her eyes. Yes, I said through gritted teeth. It's exactly 6 feet tall. She murmured, jotting something down as if my perfectly legal fence was somehow suspicious. They spent about 20 minutes inspecting every inch of my yard before finally turning their attention to my outdoor outlets, the alleged source of Karen's emotional distress. Bob crouched down to examine one of them while Linda stood nearby with her arms crossed like she was waiting for me to confess to some heinous crime. This outlet here, Bob said, pointing at the one Karen had been using. Did you tamper with it? No, I said firmly. I installed a circuit breaker tripper to prevent overloads. Linda raised an eyebrow. And why did you feel the need to do that? Because Karen kept plugging her extension cord into it without my permission, I replied. They exchanged a look. One of those silent conversations people have when they're trying not to laugh but also don't want to seem unprofessional. Well, Linda said finally, we'll have to review this with the rest of the board. Great, I said, forcing a smile. Let me know if you need anything else. A week later, I received another letter from the HOA informing me that their investigation was complete and that no violations had been found on my part. Victory. Sweet, glorious victory. But before I could celebrate, I noticed there was an addendum at the bottom of the letter. However, we encourage all residents to work together to maintain a positive and harmonious community environment. Translation: stop pissing off Karen. But here's the thing, I wasn't done yet. If Karen wanted harmony so badly, I was going to give it to her in the most passive-aggressive way possible. First, I built a new fence along our shared property line. An 8-foot-tall masterpiece made of solid wood panels that completely blocked her view of my yard. And before you ask, yes, it was 100% legal because it replaced an existing structure and complied with all HOA regulations. I triple-checked. Next, I installed motion-activated sprinklers along the fence line, ostensibly for pest control but strategically positioned so that anyone standing too close would get an unexpected shower. The first time Karen tried to peer over the fence with her ladder, yes, she actually did this. She got soaked from head to toe. It was glorious. But my piece de resistance was the sign. A tasteful wooden plaque mounted on my side of the fence that read, in elegant cursive script, "Private property. No Karens allowed." It wasn't technically against any rules because it didn't face outward toward her yard. It was just there for my own amusement, and maybe hers too if she ever managed to climb high enough to see it. For a while after that, things were quiet, or as quiet as they could be with Karen living next door. She still gave me dirty looks whenever we crossed paths, but she stopped filing complaints and kept her extension cords firmly on her side of the fence. And honestly, that felt like a win. Looking back on everything now, the letters, the inspections, the sprinkler incident, I can't help but laugh at how ridiculous it all was. Suburbia has its own kind of madness, a special brand of petty warfare fought with clipboards and bylaws instead of swords and shields. And while I wouldn't wish Karen on anyone else, part of me is almost grateful for her antics. After all, what's life without a little drama? For a while, life next to Karen was manageable. Sure, she'd still glare at me whenever I was outside, and I'm pretty sure she started parking her car slightly closer to my driveway just to annoy me. But after the fence, the sprinklers, and the "No Karens Allowed" sign, she seemed to accept that I wasn't someone she could push around anymore. Or so I thought. One day, out of nowhere, I got a knock on my door. It wasn't Karen this time. It was a man in a cheap suit holding a briefcase that looked like it had been through a war zone. He introduced himself as Karen's lawyer. That's right, Karen had actually hired a lawyer. Over what? I had no idea. But judging by the smug look on his face, he thought he had me cornered. "Mr. Jack," he began, trying to sound professional but coming off more like a used car salesman. "I'm here to inform you that my client, Miss Karen, is filing a lawsuit against you for damages." "Damages?" I asked, genuinely confused. "What damages?" He opened his briefcase with a dramatic flourish and pulled out a stack of papers that looked like they'd been printed at 2 a.m. on a printer running out of ink. "Ms. Karen claims that your actions have caused her significant emotional distress and financial loss." I couldn't help but laugh. "Financial loss? From what?" "She alleges that your sprinkler system ruined her property," he said, flipping through the papers like he was reading off a script. "You mean the property she wasn't supposed to be trespassing on?" I shot back. He ignored me and continued. "She also claims that your fence has devalued her home by obstructing her view." At this point, I was struggling to keep a straight face. "So let me get this straight," I said. "She's suing me because my fence, on my property, isn't aesthetically pleasing enough for her?" "That's correct," he said with all the confidence of someone who definitely didn't graduate top of their law school class. "Okay," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "Good luck with that." And with that, he handed me the paperwork and left. Now, most people would probably panic if they got sued by their neighbor. But not me. Oh no, this wasn't my first rodeo with Karen, and I knew exactly how to handle her nonsense. By being even more prepared than she was. The first thing I did was call my own lawyer, a friend of mine who specializes in real estate law and has dealt with more than his fair share of HOA disputes. When I told him about Karen's lawsuit, he actually laughed out loud. "She's suing you over a fence?" he asked between chuckles. "And sprinklers," I added. "This is going to be fun," he said. Over the next few weeks, we gathered every piece of evidence we could find. Photos of my property line clearly showing that the fence was within legal limits. Receipts for the sprinkler system proving it was installed for pest control. And even footage from my security cameras showing Karen climbing over the fence with her ladder before getting hit by the sprinklers, which was honestly comedy gold. When the court date finally arrived, I walked into the courtroom feeling like a contestant on one of those reality TV shows where neighbors air their grievances in front of a judge. Karen was already there, sitting at the plaintiff's table with her lawyer and looking as smug as ever. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who looked like she'd seen it all, called us to order and asked Karen's lawyer to present his case. He launched into this long-winded speech about how I'd allegedly ruined Karen's quality of life with my aggressive landscaping choices, and how she'd been forced to spend thousands of dollars on repairs because of my reckless behavior. When it was my turn to respond, my lawyer calmly presented all our evidence. The property maps, the receipts, and, of course, the sprinkler footage. By the time we were done, even the judge looked like she was trying not to laugh. "Ms. Karen," the judge said finally, turning to her with an expression that could only be described as done. "It's clear from this evidence that Mr. Jack has not violated any laws or HOA regulations." Karen opened her mouth to argue, but the judge held up a hand to stop her. "Furthermore," she continued, "it appears that you've been trespassing on Mr. Jack's property repeatedly despite being told not to." Karen turned bright red but didn't say anything. In light of this, the judge concluded, "I'm dismissing your case with prejudice." For those of you who don't speak legalese, with prejudice basically means Karen couldn't file another lawsuit about this ever again. It was over. As we left the courtroom, Karen shot me one last death glare before storming off with her lawyer in tow. And me? I went home and celebrated with a cold beer in my backyard, safe behind my glorious 8-foot fence. But here's the best part. A few weeks later, Karen put her house up for sale. Whether it was because of the lawsuit or because she couldn't stand living next to someone who wouldn't bow down to her demands, I'll never know. And honestly, I don't care. What I do know is this. Sometimes in life, you have to stand up for yourself, even if it means going toe-to-toe with a suburban tyrant armed with nothing but an extension cord and an overinflated sense of entitlement. So if you're dealing with your own version of Karen right now, whether it's a nosy neighbor, an overzealous HOA board member, or just someone who doesn't understand boundaries, remember the story. Remember that fences make great neighbors, but sprinklers make even better ones. And hey, if you enjoyed this saga of suburban warfare as much as I enjoyed living through it, well, mostly, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends who've also dealt with nightmare neighbors, leave a comment about your own HOA horror stories below, and subscribe for more tales of petty revenge and suburban justice. Thanks for watching.